don't know the world you're living in.
Welcome to the future.
Welcome again, I am the Gadfly, and today I think we should talk about postmodernism, because postmodernism seems to be on everybody's mind, at least in the political and philosophical world, and a lot of what is said to be postmodernism isn't actually postmodernism, and a lot of what is criticized about postmodernism is actually a criticism of modernism. There's a lot of talk these days about postmodernism and its influence on modern society. Like I said, not many people actually understand what postmodernism is. Very simply and quite obviously, postmodernism is the trend in philosophy that has come after modernism, and it's effectively a rejection of modernism. So in order to understand postmodernism, we have to dive briefly into what modernism was, and for the sake of understanding postmodernism, the easiest way to describe what modernism was is to say that it is an outgrowth of late medieval humanism. It's the idea that human beings can come to a more fuller understanding of their reality, that we can change the world we live in for the better, and that we can solve our problems with reason, scientific development, and technological advance, bringing us to our temporal salvation. Postmodernism, on the other hand, has traditionally rejected these base assumptions. Postmodernism does not think we can change the world we live in for the better, because to a postmodernist, value judgments are constructs. In other words, there is no better, there is just the more preferred. Nor does a postmodernist think that human beings can come to a more accurate understanding of reality, because a postmodernist does not believe that our faculties can ever actually grasp reality. This idea that reality as it is will always escape us, that morality is a construct, and that these classical understandings of the way the world works are merely holdovers from a bygone era, structurally institutionalized to maintain power in the privileged classes of society, is a key feature of postmodernist thought, at least as it is often presented. Thus, one of the key ideas of postmodernist thought is introduced: deconstruction. Deconstructionism, or deconstructivism, is an idea that is explicitly named in the writings of Jacques Derrida, and while it is a very complex thing to describe, it's basically the idea that if we can break apart and dismember the social constructs, we'll be able to remove the power those constructs have over us. If we can pull out all the Jenga blocks, the structure of power will collapse. We often see this in left-wing political thought, in which ideas of deconstruction manifest themselves in phrases like smash the binary, when talking about gender, or the basic assumption that morality is at best relative and at worst a total fabrication. Ultimately, this type of postmodernism almost inevitably leads to nihilism, or the belief that there's no meaning to any action anybody takes. There's no reason for life other than the mere facts of what goes on in the world. It leads to an obvious loss of moral grounding, and it seeks to break down and deconstruct institutions of society, regardless of their standing, because remember, value becomes subjective under postmodernism, so there's no such thing as preserving the good institutions and throwing out the bad ones. This type of postmodernism is what philosopher David Ray Griffin calls self-immolating, meaning that it is destroying not only everything around it, but itself also. If all value and truth claims are relative, and all institutions are to be deconstructed, and philosophy as an institution is to be deconstructed, then the truth and value claims of philosophy, specifically postmodern philosophy, are likewise relative and subject to deconstruction and dissolution. However, despite this problem that postmodernism presents, modernism really did have some actual problems that postmodernism was right to criticize and reject. Griffin suggests that modernity has, for example, relentlessly sought to replace primitive and medieval falsehood with modern truth, while denying that we have any knowledge that truth is better than falsehood. We can, therefore, have no objective basis for a rational discussion about value judgments. Griffin wants us to see that modernity and medieval pre-modernity have definitely left us with some problems, but the way that deconstructive postmodernism attempts to deal with these problems is itself highly problematic. And he wants us to overcome three key problems for modernity. First is dualism. The idea that the world is broken up into mind and matter as two separate substances has led to a bunch of problems in psychology, philosophy of mind, and people's religious understanding, whose implications has a massive effect on the social world. Second, he wants us to overcome the doctrine of mechanism. In its most extreme form, it gives us Descartes nailing animals to a board and cutting them open live because he believes that their squeals of horror and pain were like squeaky wheels on a chariot, purely mechanistic and not really cries of a sentient being. But in contemporary times, this mechanism gives us scientific reductionism, which makes us believe that we can understand the world as a macrocosm by understanding the microcosms within it. Thinking that everything is machine-like causes a lot of problems in the biological and astronomical sciences, for example. But these problems are beyond the scope of this presentation. And third, Griffin wants us to get rid of the modernist idea of sensationism, which he briefly explained as the doctrine that all of our experience of the world beyond ourselves is solely through our physical senses. David Ray Griffin wants to offer us instead a constructive postmodernism, a philosophy that rejects medieval supernaturalism and also rejects deconstructive postmodernism and all of its self-immolating conclusions. He develops this philosophy through his reading of Charles Hartshorne and Alfred North Whitehead, who you will remember from our previous video on false dichotomies. This philosophy is what is known as process philosophy, and it's a huge undertaking to try to explain it in its entirety, so I want to outline some of the fundamental core tenets of process thought here. Griffin says that there are three ways in which his constructive postmodernism differs from deconstructive postmodernism. 1. Radical empiricism. 2. Naturalistic theism. And 3. Pan-experientialism, which is often called panpsychism. Radical empiricism is simply the claim that knowledge comes to us primarily through our senses, but that experience, in contrast to classical empiricism, is not merely sense perception. It includes that, but it's also something much more fundamental, and when we talk about pan-experientialism, that will start to make sense. Naturalistic theism, I won't go into detail here about it, but it's important to remember that theism is a viable conclusion in process thought, because God, contrary to classical theism, is not apart from, outside of, and unaffected by reality, but in contrast, reality provides God with a very real, subjective experience. God relates to people much more ontologically in process thought than in classical thought. Also, process thought does not think the world is meaningless and without purpose, so the postmodern claim that God is dead doesn't hold much weight in process thought. Finally, the foundational claim of process philosophy is what Griffin calls pan-experientialism. This is where the school of thought takes off. Its fundamental claim is that the basic units of reality are not enduring things or substances, but momentary events. This is huge because it's a total revision of the metaphysics that the Western world has inherited from Aristotle over the past 2,000 years. The things we experience in this world as static, concrete objects are actually societies of trillions of quantum-level events that have inherited their reality from the past events, with each nanosecond providing thousands of more new experiences. This is what Whitehead called concrescence, and it's the idea that reality never becomes fully static, but we experience it as if it were, because the events are enduring through time, rather than disappearing and exiting reality, as we can see sometimes on the quantum level. Similar to how an atom is comprised of mostly space, but when they come together to form larger objects, we can perceive a solid oak tree or a liquid sea of water. Reality, on this view, becomes dynamic and happening, rather than static and being. The idea that all of these events are happening and taking place through time in such a way that the effect of their existence is handed on to the next event is similar to human history, in which the events of World War I came after the Napoleonic Wars, handed on their effect to cause World War II, which handed on its effects to cause much of what we see in modern politics. History, therefore, is not a cut-and-dried story of humanity, but rather a process of our species becoming what it is today, for better or worse. No event or society of events today is completely detached from those events of the past. However, some past events carry more weight. This is true for the development of civilization, and it's true for the development of the physical world, according to process philosophy. Griffin likewise says that there are two types of objects in the world, with objects being anything that exists that seems static, unchanging, and definite, things Aristotle would call substances. The first type is an aggregate of experiential events, such as a rock, which has no dominant center of consciousness. The second is a compound, such as an animal, like a human or a turkey, which has a unity of feeling within its entire body, because we have a dominant center of consciousness and a dominant center of experience. This usually takes place in a mind or a central nervous system of some kind. Now, you'll notice that I said experiential event. Process philosophy does think that every event is a sort of experience, in the sense that it is a memory of past events and a subjective aim for the future. In other words, these events are going to do what they have been set up to do by past events when they wouldn't care to have it any other way. This doctrine does not mean that all events have conscious thoughts and sensory perception, and it's also not to say that they are very similar to human experience. It's only to say that they're not absolutely different in kind. Modern scientists speak this way when they say that we are the universe experiencing itself. Process philosophers agree, but they find no reason to say that human beings are the only part of the universe that experiences. Though possibly the highest functioning experiencers in the universe, degree of experience does not eliminate the fact of lower degrees. So why is this version of postmodernism a better alternative to the typical version? First, it solves a lot of problems in contemporary philosophy. The mind-body problem. Matter is comprised of events, and these events bind together into societies, and in some substances and not others, a dominant center develops, such that we can think and rocks cannot. Yet, both we and rocks are happening and experiencing the act of existence. We simply have a faculty to process that experience into rational patterns. The relationship between quantum indeterminacy and human freedom, i.e., the problem of free will, is also solved. Each society of events is very strongly influenced by that which composes it, but not fully determined, and the more long-lasting and enduring a substance is, the fewer possible options open to that individual. This view likewise provides us with a coherent answer of what time is, namely the measuring of what happens between the fundamental events of reality. Additionally, it solves the problem of induction, which questions whether we should expect the future to resemble the past, because, on this view, the laws of nature are really nature's most long-lasting habits, the habits of low-level societies with very little spontaneity with which to diverge from the pattern inherited from the past. The physical scientists seem to support this particular hypothesis fairly strongly, because while it is true that today matter cannot be created or destroyed, in the first instances of time, we believe the Big Bang to have unfolded matter and energy into existence. In other words, as time has progressed, reality has developed the habit of not creating or destroying matter. But that wasn't always the case, and very technically speaking, it might not always be, but we can be fairly confident that that will be the case moving forward, because that habit is continually strengthened by every single instance in the universe in which matter is not created or destroyed. In addition to solving many of these problems, process philosophy does not bring back the old problems of pre-modern supernaturalism or simplistic rationalism. This philosophy can be said to be strictly postmodern because it rejects dualism, mechanism, sensationalism, and the rigid and static ontology of medieval and late antiquity. It denies atheism, nihilism, absolute determinism, absolute relativism, and deconstruction, and instead affirms relation, experience, reality, divinity, creativity, progress, ethics, and universally desired values such as compassion, love, justice, and wisdom. Because after all, everything we do affects the future. The weight of reality depends on us.
I'm insane, either that or everyone else is.